She's an accomplished scientist credited for making the first solid acid fuel cells in the 1990s. But what fuels Sossina Haile? She was born in Ethiopia, and at the age of 10, a series of dramatic events led her family to a small town in Minnesota. Her story of passion and resilience is next. Joining me now is chemist, fuel cell pioneer, and professor of material science and engineering at Northwestern University, Sossina Haile. Thank you so much for making the time. You know, I know a lot of the times in the industry that you're in, where it's majority men, the first question you probably get is, you're a woman, you're a black woman, how does that present a challenge to your career and in life? But you've said there's just so much more to it than that. Can you explain that?
First of all, let me say, I really recognize that I'm an anomaly in many situations, and that's unfortunate. I'd like to just ignore that and think of myself as being the chemist, the material scientist, the fuel cell pioneer, and leave it at that. What I find is that it's oftentimes very difficult to address whether or not somebody's behavior has to do with any one of those other identities. I know that statistically, if I look at the data, that women, that people of color have less opportunities for all sorts of reasons. So I recognize that, therefore, I must have also experienced that for those reasons. And you and I have discussed this. It's a way like climate science, that if there's a storm, we don't know exactly if that storm is due specifically to human-induced climate change. But we know that statistically these things occur. And so I recognize that, but I try to move on. I try to focus on where I can make contributions and work around challenges.
Let's go back in time a little bit to when you were younger and came to the States around 1976 under quite extraordinary circumstances. Your family immigrated to the United States, but under circumstances that seem like they are straight out of a movie. Can you talk about that move that many immigrants make and how that impacted who you are and what you pursued?
Yeah, that move in many ways is my parents' story. And I sometimes feel cheap in sort of making it my story. But let me tell you from my perspective as a 9-year-old kid who came over. We came as refugees. The Derg government at the time had come to arrest my father. He saw that many of his colleagues, when they were arrested, they just disappeared. So he defended himself against arrest. There was a shootout. Very sadly, he was shot at that time. Ultimately, that led to him being in a wheelchair. So my parents left for my father's medical treatment early in 75. They were in England for treatment for my father. My sisters and I did not know if we were going to be able to leave the country. I cannot imagine for my parents what it was like. But remarkably, we all reunited in the US. And 4th of July, my brother was born in 1976. My 2 sisters and I came to the US 4 days later, and there, lo and behold, we had a new baby brother. We didn't even know my mother was expecting when they left. So it was a remarkable reunion. And we were, there was still a lot of chaos. We came, with basically our suitcases. And my parents were really quite remarkable for having, kept everything together.
Interesting that you say you feel cheap sometimes making it your story. I can relate to that, and I think maybe a lot of people that come here as kids relate to that if their parents went through some extenuating circumstances. So you were 10 when you came to the States, and you moved to a really small town, I believe it was in Minnesota, of about 2,000 people. What was that, presumably, culture shock like?
Yes, that was certainly culture shock. Small town Minnesota, Minnesota has that reputation of Minnesota nice. And I would say for the most part, that's what it was like there, but also completely unknowledgeable about the world. They asked us questions like, did we live in trees? And, and of course, this was time of famine. So people who did know Ethiopia only knew about famine. We were alien. on the playground, on the first day of school, the kids, the whole classroom was there touching my hair. And at that time, I had a little bit longer hair and, puffs like this. So they're all, touching these little puffs. They just had no idea of what it was like. They would ask things like, what state is Ethiopia in? So yeah, it was very unusual that first year.
Right. There's a lot of questions that come, back in the 70s, let alone the 70s, in the 90s, when my family immigrated here. There are many questions like that in Mississippi. And I'm sure you get this question a lot in terms of, what drives you? How did you get through that time? There was a recent article in Chemistry World where they sort of zeroed in on your point about, I don't really resonate with role models. I didn't necessarily need to see role models in this field to pursue it. Can you explain that answer?
My comment there was to say that it is sometimes dangerous to see if you can find somebody that you look up to, that you want to emulate, because many times the people that we really hear about are just incredible people. And for me, I know plenty of people who I think are just far beyond what I could achieve. So it's dangerous to think of them as role models. And for me in particular, I know one Black woman in materials science who's about my peer. I don't think that I know any who are ahead of me career-wise. So I know women, and I know, Black men who are ahead of me career-wise, but there was nobody that I could say, aha, that's who I can be in my field. Certainly, I would say that my father, who was an incredible workaholic, an incredible work ethic, an incredible human ethic, was in some way a role model. And my parents, who were very supportive, were in some ways role models. But no one is ever going to have your own specific experience. So that's a little bit dangerous to think that you maybe need to find that specific person in order to be successful.
What do you say to young people that may be pursuing a field in chemistry or science, materials science, that maybe do have some parallels in the immigrant story? How would you encourage them to approach that career or that ambition?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the first part of it is having the ambition, and knowing that what you want to do is this line of pursuit, that this is what gives you joy and passion. And I'm trying to remember, I heard somebody give a really great quote, which was, somehow turn your joy into your passion into your life. But unfortunately, I'm garbling it. But all of those things is really understanding what it is that you want to do. And then there is one sort of rather specific thing that I would say in terms of immigrants from our cultural background, which is that we tend to be quiet and deferential, and these are ways of being polite and respectful, and this is what is valued, I would say, back home, and not so much valued in the Western world, certainly in the US, where you really have to speak up and you really have to tell people what your achievements are. There is no false modesty. That is just not a way to success. That it really is about telling people what you've achieved, because then they'll believe you. And I think that's really important. It took me a long time to learn that, to just be sure to make sure that people understand what it is that you have accomplished and why it's important.
And so as we wrap up, I've tried to learn what a fuel cell pioneer is. I think I know as far as, the Wikipedia definition goes, but what is it that you do and what do you love about it?
Yeah, so what a fuel cell does, and what we're trying to do is make materials that make a fuel cell better. What a fuel cell does is take a fuel like hydrogen, ideally, and convert that into electrical power. So that's the most basic step. And the idea is that we can do that very cleanly compared to simply burning the hydrogen, for example, as you might do in a power plant. And the other part of that is that hydrogen can be produced from water using solar energy or using wind energy. And ultimately, that means that we get away from using fossil fuels. So that's what drives me, and that's what we hope to ultimately achieve. My laboratory doesn't make anything that you can buy or sell and maybe even demo. We're really about the materials that make these devices better.
Great. Thank you so much. Chemist, fuel cell pioneer, and professor of material science and engineering at Northwestern University, Sossina Haile. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.